So I'd like to read the first question. And this is a question for both Anthony Arnove and Noam Chomsky. Much debate has taken place about the potential role of online social media such as Facebook and Twitter in grassroots social justice movements. Do you see the younger generation's obsession with Facebook as good for democracy?
At my age, one of your prerogatives is to talk about how the younger generation is going out.
One second. Got this taken care of.
Okay. Tell me when you're hearing. No? Can't hear? Louder? How's that? Oh, okay. Well, how about I talk louder? Okay, well, I just...
Listen carefully.
Yeah, I made the profound remark that at my age, you're supposed to have the prerogative of exploring how the younger generation is going down the tube. Not like the glory that is young. It's a mixed story, in my opinion. I mean, it's been very valuable for organization and activism. There's no doubt about that. It's a great way of communicating. On simple, straightforward things, I'll just tell you a personal experience, which I think illustrates some of the downside. I get a ton of mail, massive amounts of mail, 6-7 hours a day just answering mail. I've noticed just in the last couple of months that, okay, how's that? Any better? I've noticed in the last couple of months that the mail is somewhat changing in character. A lot of the mail is one-line questions. Sometimes questions so short that they fit in the subject line. My grandchildren pointed out to me it's probably Twitter. And when you write a one-sentence question, that means you haven't thought about it. Something came to your head, send it out, and so on. And there is this tendency with these media sort of enhance a tendency not to try to think things through, just to do something that comes to your mind quickly, but not to try to read, not to look up to see if there's an answer somewhere. And that's not good. I mean, you don't try to get answers. You don't learn anything to get answers that way. You get answers by thinking through it yourself, studying it, looking into it, reflecting, and so on. And I think that shows up in other respects. But like just much less reading. I mean, I've noticed, even in classes over the years. Years ago, I used to be able to use literary references without thinking twice about them. People would know what I'm talking about. And now it's much less the case, which is much less reading and much less thinking and planning, and that's good. So I think it's obviously been very, very valuable. On the other hand, it does kind of have a tendency towards superficiality, which could be harmful, but now we'll see what the younger generation means.
Well, as someone who's not on Facebook and who doesn't have a Twitter account, on the question, I mean, clearly in the Occupy movement, we've seen things that are brilliant when an arrest takes place and people can quickly get out a message to be at a particular spot, to engage in a solidarity action, to help get people out of jail. As a means of mass dissemination of small bits of information, it can be very valuable. We saw that also, of course, in Tahrir. But I do share some of Noam's concerns. In particular, there's also a degree to which it can reinforce the phenomenon that he was talking about earlier about the degree of atomization in our society. The lack of people coming together and having interactions like this, which are so exciting to see people together, face to face, having conversations, interacting with one another, having conversations, having dialogue. you have the experience, I'm sure all of you have seen this, where you go to a movie or you go even to a talk like this, and you'll see people who are the entire time looking at this little screen, not watching a movie, not interacting, not experiencing what is taking place in front of them. I've even been in brilliant plays where, a great performance is taking place, and there's someone sitting there, tweeting about it. Or when you go to a concert, and everyone's filming the concert, but no one is actually there, present, experiencing the concert. And I think those are aspects of the way in which technology is reinforcing that atomization. It's also leading to another phenomenon, which I think has interesting economic implications. If you work, as all of us increasingly do with any aspect of these technologies, your working hours are no longer 9 to 5 working hours. Even if they have extended to 9 to 6 or 9 to 7, you're working as you're commuting to work. You're working on the weekend, you're working late at night, you're working in the morning. It actually extends the ways in which people are exploited in our economy. And if you look at productivity figures, these are never calculated in productivity figures. Productivity figures still assume an average work week of something like 40 or 45 hours a week. And yet, of course, we know people are actually working 50, 60, 70 hours in some case as a result of the way in which some of these technologies have been very carefully integrated into the workplace. And of course, we also know from the latest WikiLeaks disclosures that the technology of surveillance that's involved in some of this new portable technology also opens up whole new areas of digital surveillance with far greater access to personal information than has ever been available about us before. And so I think there's also interesting privacy concerns that need to be increasingly addressed, particularly in social movements where there is going to be an effort, a very conscious effort, it's already begun, to disrupt movements like Occupy, and they will take advantage of those new technologies to try to do that as well.
Okay, let's move on to the next Facebook question. This question concerns Howard Zinn's ambivalence about World War II. I'd like to repeat his own words from his book, The Zinn Reader. I flew the last bombing mission thinking, never again, unquote. My question is, does this word never mean never? Or almost never? Is war ever the right option?
One of the great figures of 20th century America, not as well known as he ought to be, is a radical pacifist, A.J. Musty. Absolute pacifists had an answer. You never use violence. And Musty was a dedicated pacifist, but a subtle and thoughtful one. His position was what he called revolutionary pacifism. He said it's correct to be a pacifist, but at first you have to address what he called the 90% of the violence that's just part of the structure of society that we take for granted. That those who rise up with violence that we don't like are struggling against. And first pay attention to that. And if you do, you can then ask yourself if I'm going to be a pacifist. And he was asking it at the hardest moment in history, right during the Second World War, when it was not easy to take a principled pacifist position. And if you look at detail, he was right. I mean, I've written about it. He also pointed out correctly, I think, and this connects directly to Howard's comments, that the problem after a war is with the victor. The victor thinks he's shown that violence pays. And who's going to teach him a lesson? Those words in 1945 were very prescient. Who would teach the victor a lesson? Well, nobody, it turned out. And the costs of that have been fantastic. So, personally, I didn't agree with Howard about that. I mean, I think there was a reason to in balance to join finally in the Second World War, though. So there are a lot of things you could have done totally differently. But I think that words like these shouldn't be forgotten.
I recently was reminded of an essay that Howard wrote about civil disobedience. You can come across this essay in the Zinn reader. My friend Greg Ruggiero reminded me of it, and Greg is a terrific publisher. He publishes a pamphlet series. In fact, when Noam spoke at the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture series at Boston Occupy, the transcript of that speech and that dialogue is now available as a pamphlet from Greg's pamphlet series, and you also may know some of the books he's edited at City Lights, and before that, 7 Stories in the Open Media series. Anyway, he reminded me of this piece, which is in the Zinn reader, and I went back and read it this morning as I was coming up here. And I was really struck at how Howard ended it. He speaks of the world as we've known up to now, a world of simplistic and terrible solutions, where we oscillate constantly between 2 alternatives, the devastation of war or the injustice of peace. And I think that's a dilemma that Howard struggled with throughout his life, and increasingly toward the end of his life was grappling with. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this question, and it's a very provocative question, it's one that preoccupied Howard, to look at a piece he wrote towards the end of his life called 3 Holy Wars. And I also have disagreements with Howard on that particular perspective, but in it he grapples with not only World War II, but the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, in trying to address this question of revolutionary pacifism. And one of the things that I think was very important to how Howard came to answer the question today is that for him the technology of war had become so devastating. And it was linked, of course, in his mind also to the environmental devastation that Noam spoke about. That for him, whatever you may think of war in earlier periods, he came to the conclusion that war today inevitably meant risks that were far too great to imagine that would be the just way to resolve social conflicts. And so he wanted to at least work for and strive for and find ways of achieving radical change without resort to war. But I think I would also say, if you pressed Howard, he would acknowledge that he was not a consistent pacifist, that there were moments when he felt that the injustice of peace warranted actions which were perceived by the society, the established power, established concentrations of power, as violent, as we've seen increasingly when Occupy movements, which are being cleared through violence, are themselves being targeted and charged as if they're the source of the violence, or it's a concern for public safety that's leading the military and the police to clear those encampments. And so I think it's something Howard grappled with, and that all of us can learn a lot from thinking through how he grappled with.
Okay. Our final Facebook question is the following. Excuse me. It's a question for both of our guests. Can you comment? Sorry. Can you comment on public higher education in the United States today, and why college students need to know about Howard Zinn?
Well, they have to know about Howard Zinn because of the nature of the work that he did and the life that he lived. He lived a life consistent with his work, bringing forth the way in which people have throughout history struggled against injustice, oppression, won victories, suffered defeats, kept fighting, and finally often made great gains. And as I quoted, he's correct, it's the unknown people who've done that. He helped make them known. Well, that's a very valuable lesson to learn. Comment about higher education. Actually, in many ways, I think it's better than it was 60 years ago, with all the criticism. The things of the kind that you can discuss and talk. Meetings like this, discussions like this, let's say, would have been almost inconceivable, say, 50 years ago. Nobody was not much talking about. And that's true. It's not just here, it's all over the place. There has been a kind of a general civilizing effect of the activism of the 60s and its aftermath. And we talk about the 60s, but remember, a lot of what has happened is things that grew out of the 60s. So take the feminist movement. It was very slight in the 60s. In fact, a large part of the feminist movement in the 60s, if you go back to it, was the beginnings of struggles inside the student movement, the radical student movement, inside its most forward, courageous elements like the resistance, where kids are really taking risks, facing the fact that they themselves are oppressors. I remember very well the recognition of that. It was shattering. And that led to...
Thank you for mentioning that.
Well, that led to a lot of turmoil and trauma and thinking. And it changed in the 70s. And now it's just totally different. I mean, I think in my university, probably this university, in fact, all over the world, when I got there in the 1950s, it was, you walk down the halls, it's white males, well-dressed, obedient, doing their work, you know, smart kids, doing their work, trying to get a job, build what you have to build. Again, go back to whatever, as I mentioned before, once the missile goes up, I don't care where it goes down. But that was the 1950s. If you walk down the halls today, it looks like this. It's half women, third minorities, informal dress, which means more than just dress. It means informal relations, less deference and obedience, challenges, political action all over the place. Kids interested in everything you can imagine. That's a big change. It's a change in the society and the world. Europe's changed. Japan has changed. The whole world has changed this way. And that's only one aspect of it. Take the environmental issues that I mentioned. In the 60s, they were virtually non-existent. I mean, you read cars, you don't want TPT, but there was nothing essentially. Now it's a huge popular movement. Nowhere near what it ought to be, but huge. And the same is true in many other ways. The same is true on particular issues. I could talk about it, but there are things you can talk about openly and discuss in the universities today, which just were kind of unthinkable 40 or 50 years ago. Fundamental critique of a market system and capitalist ideology, for example. It's not beyond the pale today. In fact, it's kind of normal. You can talk about it. At the same time, there is always a reaction. Power systems do not abandon power easily. And if you take a look in the early 70s, there were very interesting publications. I don't want to go into the whole thing now, it's too long, but from across the spectrum, there was deep concern about the fact that people are getting too free, too independent, there's too much democracy, you got to read it back, you got to control people. Things like, say, on the right, the famous Powell Memorandum, which you haven't read, you ought to read. On the left, it's called the left, liberals. The Trilateral Commission report, Crisis of Democracy, essentially Carter administration liberals, all had the same view. The Social Democrats had the same view. You've got to cut back the independence, freedom of especially young people. There were specific calls, I'm quoting now, from the liberal side, demands that we do something about what were called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That's not my phrase. I'm quoting it from the liberal Democrats. The institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young aren't doing their job. That means universities, schools, churches, and so on. They're not indoctrinating the young properly. And if you take a look at things that have happened since that time, plenty of measures have been put in place to try to improve the indoctrination of the young. Things like teaching to test, which Anthony mentioned before. cutting back independence and freedom in elementary school. You know, I've talked to teachers, some of you are teachers, you know, Wayward and I've talked to teachers who tell me, you know, sixth grade teacher recently, she told me that after a class, a little girl came over to her and said she was interested in something and came up in class, wanted to know how to look into it more, and the teacher had to tell her, you can't do that. You've got to study for Massachusetts, the MCAS, you know, the test that's coming up, because everything depends on that, including my salary, but she didn't say that. Everything depends on whether you answer those stupid questions. And so you can't pursue the topic you're interested in. Well, that's a technique of indoctrination. Tuitions is a very striking technique of indoctrination. Tuitions have skyrocketed since the 70s. I don't think there's an economic necessity for that. You take, say, Mexico. Mexico is a poor country, has a very good higher education system. You know, salaries are low and so on, but good facilities, high quality, lectured there, the students are active and so on. It's free. Mexico City has a university which is not only free, but has open admissions with remedial work for students who didn't have the background to get in. And it's also pretty high quality. It's in there. Germany, another rich country, is free tuition. It's very hard to argue that these things are economic necessities. I think they're essentially techniques of indoctrination. You come out of school with, you know, $50,000 in debt or whatever it is, and you're controlled. You don't have a lot of choices. There are things you're going to have to do. Even university architecture has been changed. And this is worldwide. But starting in the 1970s, the way in which universities are built changed to eliminate places where students can gather. So you don't want to have Sproul Plaza, you know, Berkeley. So ways of getting from here to there, but not getting together. And lots of measures have been taken to try to institute indoctrination. There's a lot of commercialization of the university. So the level of there's been a huge rise in levels of management, bureaucracy, administrators, many, many layers of administrators. That's shot way up. And other things have been cut back, like faculty-student time, also shifting to temps, easily exploitable temporary laborers. That's called graduate students. A whole range of measures. It's worth studying. And all of these, I think, are measures trying to reestablish the indoctrination of the young. Partially it may have worked, but in a lot of cases not. And in general, I think there's progress and a lot of possibilities going on.
Just one thing to add to that I think Howard is kind of uniquely positioned to help students at universities and colleges think through today is that longer-term sense of history that he brings to every issue that he analyzed. Because I know certainly my experience over the last 20, 30 years of being involved in various social movements before Occupy was that there was often a degree of impatience which characterized them. So for example, when the United States was contemplating the invasion and bombing of Iraq, there was a demonstration, a brilliant demonstration on February 15th, 2003, and I'm sure many people in this room took part in those demonstrations, and it was probably at that moment in time the largest international coordinated protest in history. And it was remarkable, and it was brilliant, and if you haven't seen the images of that day, you can look. There are books and websites that have pictures of demonstrations from cities all around the globe. And I marched that day in New York City, where we were marching in the freezing cold, and in fact, the city police had literally barricaded every single block of the demonstration. So we were penned in with horses, and they made it almost impossible to have any motion, any march that day, and yet people still found ways to march, still found ways to voice their opposition. And then, of course, when the war began, there was understandably a sense of demoralization, a sense of despair. And I think a number of people at that point didn't have that sense of the longer-term perspective that Noam was talking about how long social movements take and how many detours and zigzags and challenges they have to confront in order to even begin to have the kind of impact that they set out to achieve. And Howard certainly, I think, gives one, if you study his work, that sense of a longer-term perspective and the need to make a longer-term commitment, and that it's not going to come easy and it's not going to come tomorrow. And I think that's something that people who are on campuses today, people who are joining the Occupy movement, and people who are coming up against the challenges that the movement is now immediately having to confront as its access to certain public spaces that were identified with the movement are being taken away from it. And it has to come up with new questions of how does one organize, how can we find new spaces to bring people into the movement, how can we find ways to confront and move ahead in the face of the repression we're facing. I think Howard has something deeply important to impart to people who are coming up against those kinds of political questions.
Here comes our first question from the audience. It goes as follows. This is for Professor Chomsky. Incidents of anti-Semitism have come up at the Occupy protests. Why is anti-Semitism starting to rise among the left? And what is your advice to young Jewish activists?
As far as I know, it's not true. Doubt that if you're out to look for it, you can find things. If you take a big mass of people, you're going to find a little bit of almost anything. On the other hand, this claim that there's anti-Semitism on the left, just look at its history. I mean, look at the 1960s, the early 1970s. It was probably an industry of left liberals, the Democratic Socialists were among the worst, trying to show that Dan Berrigan was an anti-Semite, that everyone who opened their mouth was an anti-Semite. There were literally efforts. Seymour Martin Lipset, well-known sociologist, was running big studies to try to run through Black Panther newspapers to see if he could find a poem written by a 12-year-old kid which had some maybe anti-Semitic implications. And okay, that shows they're all anti-Semite. The cry of anti-Semitism is a good way to shut people up. Because nobody I have to be pretty cautious about those charges. But if it's real, then you respond to it. Whatever it is, anti-Semitism today isn't even a toothpick on a mountain as compared with anti-Muslim hysteria. States in the Union here in this country passing constitutional amendments to prevent the courts from using halakha, Talmudic law, in the courts. I mean, if they did, people wouldn't laugh. But there are states doing something equally laughable and ridiculous, except that it's dangerous, trying to institute constitutional amendments to prevent them using Sharia, which is about as likely as an asteroid hitting the state. But this is all over the place. That's real. The FBI is breaking into people's houses and arresting them for what's called material support of terrorism, meaning they said something about favorable to the Palestinian movement, something like this. Nothing like that's happening to the Jewish population. I mean, if there's any bits and pieces of anti-Semitism, fine, shout it down, argue against it. But I think it is really extremely slight if it's there at all as compared with major movements of hatred, repression, hatred of immigrants, of blacks, racism, anti-Muslim racism, which is extraordinary and really major phenomenon.
Another question for Professor Chomsky. Can you speak to President Obama's silence during the recent union battle between Governor Walker and civil workers in Wisconsin, or S-1867, striking repression, riot cops versus other countries' repressors?
Yeah.
President Barack Obama has never been a pro-labor figure. He himself has taken actions which are very harmful to public workers. So take, for example, the lame duck session. You know, there was lame duck session, you know, after the 2000 election, a couple of months before the next session. And he was very highly praised by his supporters at that time for being very presidential, doing some really great things during that period. And what did he do? Well, one of the main things he did was institute a tax rise for federal workers. Now, they didn't call it a tax rise. They called it a pay freeze. So if you think for a second, the pay freeze for federal workers is exactly the same as a tax rise for federal workers. So in this period where everyone's screaming about we can't raise taxes, Obama went out of his way to raise taxes on federal workers. He got away with it. He shouldn't have. And in general, he came into office thanks to, in no small measure, thanks to the efforts of union activists to get out to vote for him, to work for him, to put a lot of effort and energy into it. And he just completely let them down. There was going to be car check legislation. That went out the window immediately. Opportunities to organize. The health care was very striking. The health care program that he put through insisted on cutting back one category of health care, what were called Cadillac health plans. They're actually Chevrolet health plans. But these have to be the health plans that union workers have fought for decades. I mean, part of it, I don't think it was a wise tactic, but part of the way the American labor unions function, different from the Canadian ones incidentally, is to give up a lot, but to get good health programs for themselves in a contract with employers. Well, you know, to their surprise, the employers said the hell with the contract, and they didn't want to pay for it. Canada, incidentally, the same unions, UAW, insisted on health care for everyone, not just for the union. Anyway, like the tactic or not, one of the main things that union workers fought for decades was to get decent health care. Obama's one main proposal was, let's kill those health care the health care that you guys want. Well, they didn't like it. In fact, you recall that there was an election in Massachusetts, crucial election, when Senator Kennedy died. There was a replacement election, and a Republican won. And that was the 60th vote that blocked, 59th vote, blocked the filibuster, and made them able to filibuster. Why did they win? Well, there was a long study of this, and a careful study, and it was interesting. One reason Scott Brown won is a ton of money poured in from financial institutions. They went for free. Another reason was that voting was quite heavy in the affluent suburbs, which tend to be Republican, and much lower in the poor urban working class centers, which tend to be Democratic. But one of the most striking results was among union workers. It turned out that among union members and their families, not many voted, but I think a majority may have voted for Brown. And when this was investigated, it turned out that they were simply infuriated that Obama had sold them down there. They worked hard for him. Everything they wanted, he gave up, including particularly the health care programs. they'd fought for that. And he said, well, you can't have it, because that's Cadillac program. And of course, they were furious. So when Obama did nothing about, a couple of phrases about Michigan, which is a surprise to me.
No.
Okay, our next question. Professor Chomsky, when the Tea Parties began, you mentioned that they were fueled by legitimate grievances. You have been more explicit in endorsing Occupy Wall Street. Why did two movements with often similar grievances diverge so radically on various issues and capitalism itself?
Well, if you want a good explanation of this, there's a very good book on it by Paul Street and Tony DiMaggio. I forget what it's called. There's something about what they did a very careful, they're very good analysts. They did a very careful analysis of the Tea Party movement. And what they found is what we don't know. It's basically a media creation. It's not a popular movement. There are a lot of people who are sympathetic with it because they have the grievances that they think the Tea Party is speaking up for, like they're against bailout of banks, they're against government corruption, all these things they're against. So, okay, the Tea Party people seem to be saying that, fine, I'm kind of sympathetic. So support for the Tea Party movement was not low, and that's what I was referring to. But I don't think support had anything to do with what they actually were. It's a small, relatively affluent, white, nativist movement, which is internally totally incoherent. It's important to recognize that. That's not necessarily a criticism. It's just a description that touches on the country. Take a look at their beliefs. There have been some careful studies of the attitudes of Tea Party members, people who identify themselves with the Tea Party, who said, get the government off my back, small government, and so on. And their attitudes are very interesting. They're mostly social democrats, literally. So they think there ought to be more spending on health and more spending on education, no spending on welfare, but more spending for women with dependent children. So you can't be for welfare because that was demonized by Reagan. Welfare means, rich black women driving in their chauffeured limousines. Welfare has to take out your money. Well, nobody's in favor of that. So no welfare, but more money for the things the welfare does. A very striking example, which incidentally was over many years, is foreign aid. It tells you a lot about the country and about propaganda. People are very much opposed to foreign aid, very high opposition. Because why should we be giving our money away to undeserving people in the third world? But when they're asked, what do you think foreign aid is as a proportion of the budget, they give highly inflated figures, way beyond what it is. But most interestingly, when they're asked what they think it ought to be, about twice as high as it actually is. And this runs across all of things. So yeah, more spending for education, more spending for health, more spending for people's needs, and so on, but get the government off the back. That's, these are the kinds of things that you find in a deeply confused electorate, deeply confused community. But I think basically there's kind of like decent sentiments behind it. And it's the kind of, as far as the Occupy movement is concerned, that's what they ought to be mobilizing. They ought to be mobilizing decent sentiments. Incidentally, there's a striking difference between the Occupy movement and the Tea Party non-movement. The Tea Party phenomenon has a huge amount of money behind it. And it's just capital pouring into it, because they're their shock troops. They're their stormtroopers. That's what they're going to use to beat down taxes on the rich and so on, whatever the people actually want. On the other hand, the Occupy movement, that's just people. The Occupy movement is a mass popular movement. It's not like, it doesn't get, it's not a big army, Koch brothers and those people.
All right, I'd like to combine two questions into one. Should the Occupy movement formally organize and enter the political arena as a unified party? And can you comment on the practical use of the principles of anarchism by the Occupy movement? This is for both of our speakers.
Noam said I get the hard question. Actually, I want to talk about the decision-making process of the Occupy movement and perhaps say something that's swimming slightly against the stream. Because certainly an inspiring aspect of the Occupy movement is the degree to which it's trying to create decision-making structures that are democratic, that are participatory, that are inclusive, that give people a voice in this movement. And to the extent that they're doing that, it's very exciting and it's a very important element of this movement. And it's one of the reasons why so many people have made really life-changing commitment to Occupy. I've met a number of people who came down, weren't sure what was going on at Occupy, spent some time there, and really have found through the process of interacting with the activists that they've encountered there, coming across these new ways of organizing and organizing discussion, decision-making, really something that makes them feel that they have nothing more important that they could be doing with their life right now. And that's tremendously exciting and inspiring. But at the same time, I think there are limits to the extent to which those decision-making structures that have been adopted in the main by the Occupy movement can sustain the future growth of the movement. And what I have observed to a certain extent are the ways in which some of those decision-making structures are actually limiting democracy and democratic participation. And I'll just say a few of them. And I think these are things that we have to grapple with and debate. I don't have the answer, but I was reminded of an essay that came out in the 1970s by Joe Freeman called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And if you haven't read the essay, I highly recommend reading it. It's a very powerful piece where she writes about her experience in some of the New Left organizations that used similar, not necessarily the exact consensus models. And one of the things that she described was ways in which lack of majority decision-making meant that certain people who could stay the longest, who could spend the most time in a particular decision-making process, who were the most eloquent, who were the most forceful in terms of their personality, could actually end up becoming people who were having undue weight in the decision-making process. And I think that's a real and legitimate issue that has to be addressed and questioned. The other is the extent to which working class people can participate in a physical decision-making process in a space like Zuccotti Park. I mean, the park itself can only hold so many people. Only so many people are able to be away from family, children, work, etc., in order to participate in General Assembly. You want to find ways of involving those people, of including those people, of giving those people a sense of ownership and decision-making in this movement. And I think that that's increasingly going to mean finding ways of having decision-making, meetings, participation, discussion that aren't defined by one physical space. But we're beginning to see through neighborhood encampments, we're beginning to see through spokes councils in some cases, we're beginning to see through more issue-based groups. But I do think there's another question that I would also raise about the consensus model, or the 90% consensus model. And this was actually put very well the other night at a meeting I attended by Olivier Besancenot, who people may know as a French activist. He actually ran for president in France as an independent candidate, and he's a member of a new, very interesting organization in France called the Anti-Capitalist Party in France. And he made a very interesting point that I hadn't thought of before, but I think really bears consideration. He was talking about the ways in which elements of our movement we hope to be prefigurative of what a future society, a more democratic, more participatory society would look like. And certainly that's behind some of the drive of the structures that people are grappling towards discovering in the Occupy movement. But he also then pointed out something that I take very seriously, which is he didn't want to live, and I certainly don't want to live in a society where people have to have consensus. That we have to actually be fighting for a society where people can disagree. People can have fierce disagreements about things that are very important. For example, what is the most environmentally sustainable way to build a particular community or organize in a particular community? And those are questions that can't be necessarily solved in a consensus model, and that there might have to be other forms of democratic decision-making that actually are more reflective of the idea of creating a society that can have those kinds of conflicts, those kinds of debates, those kinds of disagreements, and yet resolve them on the basis of, not on the basis of coercion or the basis of whoever has the most forceful personality, but on the basis of genuinely democratic processes that allow us to make decisions which as a society we have to make. And in any large group, this complex decision-making processes are hard enough, but I think they can in some cases become impossible if we have to meet the requirement of consensus. So those are just a few cautionary ideas that I would raise.
One word on the political party board. There's a kind of a feeling, there has been a sense in the left that we can just find the right candidate and he can run for president, and then if he gets in, everything will be great. But you can't do that. I mean, if your favorite saint won the presidency, that person can do zero. You have to have Congress, you have to have governors, you have to have local people, you have to have popular organization. But this is something that the right has understood. That they were building up from the bottom, electing people to local school boards, state legislatures, finally trying to build a network from which maybe some kind of political candidacy can emerge. But you just can't leapfrog over all that within a parliamentary system. Maybe you want to do other things, not in a parliamentary system. After all, there are other forms of political action. But if you're thinking in terms of the parliamentary system, that's the only way to do it.
We've reached the end of our event, very sadly, so I'd like you to join me in expressing our gratitude to Anthony.
Thank you.